Okay. Okay, good evening, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Meira Neggaz, and I am so proud and honored to serve as the Executive Director of the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. You probably all know us by our acronym ISPU. So thank you so much for joining us here tonight, for your interest in our work broadly, and for your interest and time tonight for this fireside chat. This is the third in our series of fireside chats. And it's really our hope in doing these that these sort of informal sessions allow us to peel back the curtain a little bit for a behind the scenes look at our projects, at our work, at our organization, and at the pretty incredible people who inhabit ISPU. We're going to start today by just having a little conversation with these two amazing colleagues of mine, sharing some information about this new project that hasn't even been released yet. And then we'll be opening it up for questions and discussion for the latter part of the talk. I'm going to try to leave ample time for that. So, think about what questions you might have, if any, or if you have any suggestions or comments. We really would love this to be conversational. We will be doing a more formal research sharing event or webinar later on when this work is actually published. So this is really meant to be sort of an informal precursor to that. It's potentially a big group today. So far we're good, but we still want to kind of retain the conversational feel. So just imagine that we're sitting around a campfire instead of on a stuffy webinar. We are recording this just to share with those other people who registered. We had quite a number of people register for this. So we just want to make sure that those who are unable to attend get to listen in. Keep yourself on mute unless you're talking, please. And if you want to start off by just sharing something in the chat box, perhaps, where you're calling in from, maybe what you were interested in and how come, you joined tonight, kind of what brought you here tonight, that would be great. Before we get started in conversation, I just wanted to provide a little bit of context for the project that you're going to be hearing about. So as many of you know, ISPU's mission is to conduct and share research and education on topics impacting upon Muslim communities in the United States so that everyone can make better informed decisions and have better informed dialogue and conversations. We've been doing this for more than 20 years now, and throughout that time, we've built up a really strong body of research, both for and about Muslims in America, that really spans the community's diversity of identities and lived experiences. And this year, we're diving really deep, exploring, what it means to be at the many intersections within which most, if not all, Muslims in America live. This soon-to-be-published project that we're going to talk about tonight is focused on interfaith dynamics within Black communities. And it's the first, and now thankfully one of a number of projects that examines these interfaith dynamics among communities beyond a sort of typical white lens or framing. And we're really excited to further the conversation and discussion in this way. Today, we're joined by two people, Kameelah Mu'Min Rashad, our primary investigator on this project. Her bio could fill a few pages, and I'm not going to go through it all, but she is an ISPU scholar. She's also the founder and president of the Muslim Wellness Foundation, and she's a visiting assistant professor of psychology and Muslim studies at the Chicago Theological Seminary. I'll stop there, but honestly, that's just the tip of the iceberg. We're also joined by ISPU's very own research project manager, who is equally as accomplished and who's been working very closely with Kameelah throughout this project. So welcome, Kameelah and Erum, and thank you everyone for joining tonight. So I want to get right to it. And Kameelah, I'm going to start with you. So as the lead researcher, and honestly, as I recall, you were the real spark behind this project and this idea. Can you tell us a little bit about how this project came about and why you thought it was important to actually do this study?
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. It is my pleasure to be here. I'm really excited by this research, and I think what really endears my heart to ISPU as an organization is a willingness to talk about these really complicated and nuanced dynamics in a very clear way, and one in a way that is focused on, like, what do we do with what we know? And so I would say, to give you all a sense of the backdrop for this work on really exploring in a more in-depth way Black Christian views of American Muslims, and then thinking specifically about Black Christian views of Black Muslims, there are sort of three major sort of points that converge in really being able to catapult this research forward. And the first is the 2019 ISPU Islamophobia Index, which looks at the level of endorsement of anti-Muslim stereotypes on a scale from 0 to 100. And one really surprising, but also kind of baffling sort of finding was that of the Black respondents to this poll, the level of endorsement of anti-Muslim stereotypes, whether the respondent was Democrat or Republican, was about 33, which was a relatively high Islamophobia index score. And so with that point, we wanted to really explore, what does this mean, right? We don't want to make assumptions or sort of draw conclusions without asking community members their thoughts and opinions, their attitudes about Muslims, so that we can get a fuller picture of this very particular data point. The second, which occurred during the same year as the poll in 2019, was that there was a social media incident with a Black female comedian from Baltimore, in which she made some Islamophobic and insensitive comments about 4 sick men that were on a plane. She was also on that flight. She said that she felt threatened by them. She thought that they were Muslim, and the sort of backlash and the conversation via social media was sort of calling her and holding her accountable for statements which were essentially Islamophobic. And in that conversation, I drew together a small group of folks, Muslim and Christian, to talk about, what does this mean for, again, someone who is part of a racially minoritized group to then make statements, right, discriminatory against another marginalized group. And what this comedian said was, in part, in her later apology, was, we have Muslims in my family. However, I was totally unaware of the different types of Muslim. Sikh men are not members of the Muslim faith. And so here was like another point at which we thought, how do we understand this phenomenon? And the comment on social media also happened within days of the Christchurch massacre in New Zealand. So what people were pointing out is that Muslims are actually a targeted group, that these Islamophobic statements have very real consequences, can be deadly. So how do we hold folks who are oppressed in some context accountable? The other point is, in that same year, again, 2019, right, all of this is converging, I published my dissertation, my doctoral research on Black Muslim emerging adults and their psychological well-being. And in that study, many of the young people reported, or a theme that emerged was this question of, are you a real Muslim? And what they explained was the religious microaggressions that they experienced from their Black Christian friends and family members, that it bordered on sort of benign at times, but could also be very overt, that somehow being Black meant that they could not also be adherents of a different faith outside of Christianity. The fourth point I want to make really quickly is that in 2011, right, so now we're talking about 12 years ago, Dr. Sawad Abdul Kabir, who's also a professor, an anthropologist, and the founder of Sapelo Square, published an article in the Huffington Post with the headline, "The Peculiar Case of the Black American Islamophobe." And in that article, she's pointing out, again, how do we understand this phenomenon of, anti-Muslim bigotry emerging in the language and the actions of Black Americans? And so all of these sort of points of interest converge on the question of, we need to ask, right? We can sort of speculate about this phenomenon, but what happens when we bring a group of Black Christian and Christian adjacent folks together to talk about what does this mean, right? What comes to mind when you think of American Muslims? How are they talked about in your community? How do you encounter Muslims? What have been your experiences? So again, we can start a conversation and find out what's happening beneath the surface.
You have me thinking so many. I have a million questions for you, Kameelah, but I'm gonna leave it to our audience later and move on to a question for Erum. Erum, as our research project manager, you manage the day-to-day of this project. Can you just tell us a little bit about the project itself and the goals that we're trying to achieve in doing this?
Thank you so much, Meira and Dr. Rashad. So first, in terms of the goals at ISPU, well, I think Kameelah did, outline the goals really well just now, talking about how this project was based on a quantitative finding from our American Muslim poll. And that fits in really well just institutionally with our goals. At ISPU, we aim to have a certain proportion of our projects to be based on prior findings. And people who know me and my love for research know that you start with a question and you end up with just more questions that you want to dive into. And so that's what's so exciting about this project, is that it stems from and builds from our research, and it just allows us to go further. And so this project really was to get at the why behind a finding that we discovered in American Muslim poll. And so what was really important is to get at that why and that explanation behind a number that you get in a poll. It's actually really important to implement the correct methodology. And so in this case, to really get at that why and to get at that nuance that this topic requires, we found that qualitative methodology, it was the way to go. And so for this project specifically, we looked at focus groups. We conducted focus groups and interviews. So 8 focus groups were conducted between March 2020 and December 2020. And I'll come back to those dates for something in a minute. The participants of the study were individuals self-identifying as Black Christian or Christian adjacent. And I might leave that term to Dr. Rashad to explain further as she goes into the findings. We also conducted 6 one-on-one interviews among the same population between April 2021 and June 2021. All the focus groups and interviews were recorded and transcribed and went through, the qualitative analysis, which is, going through the transcripts and identifying emerging themes that arose over these conversations. And one last point, just in terms of project management and sort of a technical aspect of this project, was that we literally held our first focus group for this project 1 week before the nation went into lockdown, like in early March 2020. We were in person in DC. Everything went well. We were excited to move forward with our next groups. And then, the next week, our lives just completely changed. And, we all know that. So obviously we had to pause and regroup on this study. Everybody on an individual level was going through a lot, as well as, organizationally. And then obviously you can't go around asking research participants to join a study when they're going through a pandemic and nationwide lockdowns. So we had to regroup, give everybody time to sort of reset or figure out what's going on, and come back at the right time. But I think it's important to note this because we did eventually come back, finished all the data collection, despite, so many challenges, having to pivot to virtual, and that kind of shifted the makeup of our sampler, what we were originally thinking, in terms of geography. But I think the fact that we came back and kind of pushed through was really a testament to the importance of this project and the commitment on the part of both ISPU and Dr. Rashad to kind of see this project through. So just kudos to everyone involved. And we're really excited to be at this stage now where we can share out findings.
This is a perfect segue into my next question, which was about challenges, and that was clearly a very large one. But in addition to sort of the disruption of the pandemic, what, Kameelah, this is sort of for you, what have been some of the other challenges that you faced or that the team has faced in conducting this research?
Yeah, so I agree with Erum that our continued commitment to this research, one is that it hasn't been done, right? And so we really wanted to be thoughtful about how we invite folks into the conversation. And I was very clear about, my own identities as someone who is Black, a descendant of enslaved people, both in the US and in the Caribbean, with the majority of my extended family being Christian. That for me, this was also an invitation to some of the conversations that Black Muslim families are having, Black Muslim families who are connected to, our extended family members who are Christian. Like, how do we also make sense of some of the dynamics that we experience, right? Personally, interpersonally, and in a country in which you see, even now, but certainly then in 2020, increased sort of polarization around race and religion. You see an increase just, again, sociopolitically. This is the summer of, what's called the summer of racial reckoning, following the murder of George Floyd. So in addition to the pandemic, we have this sort of what's been ignited, right, is a focus on racial injustice, of anti-Black racism, sort of the impact of white supremacy and Christian hegemony on different communities. And so one of the challenges is, one, extending an invitation that moves this conversation from what we might talk about, we meaning members of the Black and African American community that are Muslim and have extended family members who are Christian, and move it more publicly, right, to really an understanding of the phenomenon, right? What do we call this thing that's happening when in our minds, we might think of someone who perhaps engages in religious microaggressions or Islamophobic language or behavior as white, right? As someone who has all privileged status and is unaware of their behavior. And so when we're thinking about sort of the tensions and the ruptures that are happening around racial injustice, part of the challenge is, do we have the collective bandwidth to complicate, right, the questions a bit and say, well, as someone who is part of a racially minoritized group, as a Black Christian, you have religious privilege, right, in this country. When we're at a moment where we're talking about Black solidarity, Black identity, racial injustice, can we also say, we can do that, right? We can talk about how fraught that might be and have a discussion about the ways that Black Muslims are kind of further invisibilized in this conversation. And so a perfect example is the murders of Stephon Clark in California because of police brutality, and more recently, Tyree Nichols, who we found out later had also embraced Islam just this past summer, right? And so as Black Muslims are sort of standing at this crossroad and this convergence of all of these issues, we also as a community have to talk about, right, what is those more sensitive and really delicate conversations about privilege and marginalization.
Before I pose an additional question, just a reminder to everyone attending, we will open this up for you all to ask questions or share insight. We'd like to have dialogue with you all. So if you have a question that you want to put in the chat or in the Q&A, that's fine. We'll also open it up in a few minutes so that if you're on camera, you can come off mute and pose a question. So be thinking about what you would like to share, if anything, or to ask. But before we get to that, I think, a lot of us are wondering, so what are they finding, right? What are you finding in this research? The
Yeah.
$1 million question. So maybe we can, this research is not published yet. It's soon to come out. But can you share some sort of themes that are coming up, some golden nuggets that you might be able to share now?
Absolutely. So I'm going to give you all kind of a visual picture, kind of a very short visual summary of the findings. And I want you to also take note of where you feel surprised or perhaps where you feel validated, right? Like this is something I experienced, or this is something I've observed. And now there's actual research, right, behind it that validates some of your individual and personal experiences. So here we go. So our project is called Exploring Black Christian Views of American Muslims. And in those questions we posed, it was to really think as broadly as possible about experiences, right? And allowing space for folks to talk about, right, the complexity of identity when it comes to race and religion. The focus groups, I might add, were facilitated by Reverend Cantina Washington Leaphart. I was present for those interviews, but off camera. And so the reason behind that was for us to think about what happens in Black Christian spaces that allows for a very transparent and open and honest conversation about religion. So some of the major findings, particularly related to Black Muslims, came up in this question, right? What and or who has had the most influence on your views or opinions about Black Muslims? One of the sort of the key findings is that for Black Christians, Black Muslims were sort of the most immediate reference group, that when they sort of referred to Muslims and we asked them to like be very specific, they told us, well, I'm thinking about Black Muslims when I think about American Muslims specifically. And the three most influential areas, again, this may not be surprising, was family and personal relationships, so immediate and extended family members, friends and colleagues. Second being those Muslims who were visible in their communities or neighborhoods, either in the past, like growing up, or as adults. And the association most immediately articulated was with the presence of the Nation of Islam. And also that Black Muslims sort of represented those in communities and neighborhoods that were very much advocates for social justice and activism. And then lastly, the third most influential category for most Black Christians who responded was the autobiography of Malcolm X and the movie X. And this was in 1992. So this is almost 30 years ago, the movie came out. And then the autobiography of Malcolm X almost 60 years ago. So between 30 and 60 years, still the most indelible sort of reference or influence in media and pop culture is related to Malcolm X as a figure. And yesterday being the 50th anniversary of his assassination. When we asked them again to think about why are these the book, the movie, these groups and community influential, one African-American male respondent said, I think there's a surface knowledge of Muslims or Islam, but not a depth to it. Most of our exposure comes from the Malcolm X movies, of the book, or the Brothers on the Corner, some of that. But I don't think there's been that much intentional or in-depth exploration of the Muslim tradition. And so I think this quote here really exemplifies Black Christians sort of identifying the limitations of their knowledge. And I would sum this up simply as Black Christians know a lot of Muslims, but very little about Islam, the faith. When we asked, who would you say are the most well-known Black Muslim figures presently or in the past and why? Again, perhaps no surprises here, right? Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X, and Louis Farrakhan were names that Black Christians repeatedly referenced as most well-known, right? Also, these two women, Betty Shabazz and Clara Muhammad. So Betty Shabazz being both the wife of Malcolm X, but also an educator and activist in her own right, and Clara Muhammad, the wife of Elijah Muhammad, but also, again, an educator and activist, looked at as sort of one of the pioneers of even the homeschool movement early in the 1900s. We also asked, and we encouraged our focus group participants to be very candid, right? How are Muslims talked about in the communities in which you are a member? And so this is what we found, right? Along a spectrum from reverence and respect, referencing, the kinds of socio-political activism, advocacy that Black Muslims are known for in communities, to a kind of compassionate paternalism, right? And these are words drawn directly from those interviews. The compassionate paternalism being, we appreciate what you do, but we're not quite sure your adherence of a faith that will lead to your salvation, right, in the afterlife. To what was called gleeful ignorance, right? Like, I'd rather just in some ways talk about our commonalities as Black people rather than our religious or spiritual differences. And then that moving to what one participant called a secret prejudice, that there was this sort of aversive racism, this very subtle hidden anti-Muslim bigotry that would sort of manifest in different comments that Christians might make offhandedly or in response to a Black Muslim present. And this, the range ending with what I would call like a hegemonic dismissal and disdain, right? And it sounds like some of the themes that I will bring out later, but the dismissal being something like, I love you, but I'm afraid for your soul. I do not think that you're on the right path. I do not think that you worship in the correct manner. And so I'll go back just one second, along that reverence and respect to dismissal and disdain, right, we find this range. And at times that this coexists, right? Like, there is great admiration for the discipline and the advocacy of Black Muslims, while also feeling and holding sort of the secret prejudice. So some of the significant themes that also emerged in the interviews, both in the group and individually, fall in these three categories: around gender and the invisibility of women, which I'll explain, intraracial faith evasiveness, or this religio blindness, and I'll explain that as well. And then also the influence of Christian exceptionalism, or this doctrine of salvation. So these are some direct quotes, again, from the focus group and individual interviews. One person said, I think of men when I think of Black Muslim. I just sat here for the last 5 minutes trying to think of a woman, and the only one that came to mind was Ilhan Omar. And that's a new name to me. We couldn't really think of any prominent Black women. I think of the impeccably dressed Black men on the corner selling the bean pies and the newspapers. When I hear the words Black Muslim, I think of those men. I can't think of any women, and that's troubling. And then lastly, I think of bow ties and a dope suit. Those brothers be fresh. So that's what I think of when I hear Black Muslim. So what started to emerge in almost every discussion was the image of Black Muslim was most readily identified as a man. Right. So where are the women? How do we think about women, again, being community builders, being contributors, but in the imagination of Black Christians being invisible? The second was around this intraracial faith evasiveness, so that Blackness is viewed as an all-encompassing or the most significant identity. One participant said, not to say that theologically there aren't differences, but at the end of the day, I mean, that's a Black person just like me. We still have the same enemy, and that's racism and white supremacy. There's a need or desire for unity against racial oppression, and that contributes to an avoidance of, again, these really delicate intraracial dynamics around diversity. One said, fam, I'm just trying to stay alive, right? Like, can we focus on Black solidarity in the face of oppression? And lastly, that Islam threatens the perception of a monolithic Blackness, which is most associated with Christianness. And that sounded like Black Muslims are an antagonistic sect of Black America that we as Black Christians are taught to demonize. And Islam is the naughty faith for Blacks, right? Those who want to rebel or, in some ways engage in counterculture movements and activism turn to Islam. And then finally, the influence of Christian exceptionalism, in that Christianity is the right and appropriate and superior way of connecting with the Creator, of experiencing an afterlife, right, and in heaven. So this disdain for Muslims emerged from what's called a soteriological crisis, right? So acknowledging another deity, right, another creator, another divine, means that I'm diminishing, right, my allegiance to and support of what I understand or who I understand God to be. And this sounded like a participant saying, they're not looking towards Jesus. They don't have a hope in heaven. They, Black Muslims, didn't have a hope for the future because their faith didn't have Jesus in the same way. One said, and some of this was Black Christians sort of recounting also what they had heard in their context, in their family of origin, as children or as adults. These people ain't saved. They need to know Jesus, where they're going to end up when they die. The only way to salvation is through Christ. And then finally, they were very angry about the idea that we would bring in people from different religions. And this is a participant talking about their church. There was a lot of talk about new Christians, people who were maybe just starting their Christian walk, and how this could deter or confuse them, or that it would be harmful to bring in folks of other religious traditions. But there were also conversations during these focus groups that focused on how Black Christians understood their ongoing relationship with Black Muslims, but also the history of Islam in Black America. And one pastor said, I'm a better Christian because of Islam. And as sort of looking to recommendations or what needs to happen differently in order for Black Christians and Black Muslims specifically to engage in a dialogue that feels very honest, that feels like a deepening and perhaps a repair of some of the ruptures, was offered by this participant. We as a Black Christian community can take steps to not take Black Islam for granted. The cultural contributions that Black Muslims have given to our communities are real. We should take stock of that beyond Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, move beyond this discourse of the nation and civil rights movement, and start to really consider the diversity of Black Islam. So some of the recommendations made by participants themselves, right? So I think the beauty of this research, if I might just say, is as folks were speaking amongst themselves, there was a lot of insight, a lot of awareness of what it means to be both part of a racially minoritized group with religious privilege, right? So what must we do? What kind of reflection must we have as Black Christians? Many of the participants were asking themselves in order to rectify, right, some of the invisibility of women, not being able to think about the contributions of Black Muslims in contemporary times, and also this notion that because you believe in a law and that you worship differently, then your soul is at stake. So participants offered these four, just again a summary, but of the recommendations offered, these again emerged as some of the most prominent themes: addressing Christian privilege and hegemony, acknowledging Black Muslim intersectional invisibility, identifying gaps in theological education, and understanding power, right, and positionality in who is gifted with the power to invite, right? Are Black Christians inviting Black Muslims? Are Black Christians primarily engaged in interfaith conversations with South Asian and Arab Muslims, and thereby sort of avoiding or not engaged in fruitful dialogue with their Black Muslim siblings? But these were, I think, really promising next action steps that really speak to a period of reflection, of repair, and potentially a deepening of the relationship. So I will stop there, and of course, welcome questions that folks have.
So we're going to get to that in just one second, but Kameelah, you've led me to my last question, which was a perfect segue, which is, there's clearly so much power in this research, right? So what now? And I'm going to pose that to both of you and give you each, a minute or two to talk about it before we open it up to questions. So everyone who's listening, please put your questions in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, I can just call on you. You can unmute. But Erum and Kameelah, and maybe either one of you can start. But ISPU, we take our tagline of research making an impact really seriously. And we follow a three-pronged process of discovery, which Kameelah, you've so eloquently described and talked about some of the themes that are coming out of this research. And with that, ISPU uses that to educate the public and equip change makers. So my question is, what's next, right? Once this comes out, what's next? And what do you both hope happens once this gets released into the world? I don't know, Erum, why don't I just start with you and we can close with Kameelah, and then we will, I promise everyone, we will open it up to questions in just 2 minutes. So please be ready.
Okay, great. Sure, I can get started. Just a couple things on my end. One is that, so I recently attended, I think last fall, with Dr. Rashad, a presentation that she gave on this study to Black Interfaith Fellows. And I was really in awe that day. What I witnessed was really a testament to the need for this study. And it kind of opened the window of the potential impact that it will have. As we mentioned, the study is groundbreaking and that it has not been studied before. It's so unique and one of a kind. And what I sensed that day in the room from both Black Muslims and Black Christians was a validation of deeply personal experiences that these individuals have had. And it really left me feeling grateful that we were able to do this research and just so excited about the potential. I felt like people were just like, that's my life you've just described in a research and empirical way. So I think it's just going to be really validating for people and open the door for these really important conversations that need to take place. And on that note, I'm really excited to share that, as Meira talked about our educate and equip that we do after we complete research discovery, we're really excited that we've received additional funding from the Pew Charitable Trust dedicated to educate and equip phases of this study. Normally we have to kind of do that within the limited project budget that we have, but we're really excited to have dedicated funding. So some of that work will include reaching large numbers of Black Christian and Black community leaders, as well as potentially Black Muslim leaders with these findings, creating these convenings and these spaces where these really personal and important conversations will take place. And within the scope of this grant, we plan to develop a curriculum, that will be used in these trainings and hopefully can be replicated. And I'll pass that question on to Dr. Rashad now.
I'll say really briefly, because I see a lot of good questions happening in the chat and there's comments that I think what the potential and the possibilities is the validation of personal experiences. And for us to, at this point, thinking about sort of the socio-political trajectory of this country, having, I think, mature and nuanced and complex conversations about race and religion and power and privilege. And I think it really challenges us to think about what is the sort of contemporary influence of Black Muslims, how our identity shifts based on where we are. So if I'm in Senegal, right, as I was in December, for me to call myself a Black Muslim almost feels redundant, right? Like everyone, the majority of the country, African people, Muslim, but what the term means here has a very specific historical and political meaning. And so how we're using language, how it shifts, that Black Muslims, collectively include those who are not just descendant of enslaved Africans, but those who are recent immigrants or relatively recent immigrants from West and East Africa, from the Caribbean. So even Black Muslim identity is very nuanced. And so I think it's really a great opportunity to open the conversation, literally sort of putting to the side for a second, prioritizing sort of white Christian sort of conceptualization of communities, but how as communities of color, Black communities, how we're perceiving ourselves, right? And what has been the impact of white supremacy and Christian hegemony on the ways that we relate and build relationships with one another. So having research that really supports the launch of really in-depth and overdue conversations is just really exciting. And I think one that we all can really embrace with enthusiasm and with an honesty that will allow for us to break through some of the silences, I think, that have limited the conversation.
That's great. There's just so much potential with this as soon as it comes out. So it's really, really exciting. And, sort of starting with these first few presentations that you've done, Kameelah and Erum. We have a couple of questions in the chat, in the Q&A, and a lot of great conversation happening in the chat. So I guess we'll start with the questions in the Q&A. The first one being, it used to be that the Black community and Muslimness were highly synergetic. Black communities desired the presence of Muslims as a source of social stability and uplifting, which seems to be quite different than the current relationship between Black communities and Black Muslims. What happened, and how can we regain that status within the Black community?
Well, what I would say really briefly in response to that question is that yes, there was apparent synergy, right, in terms of the value added by the presence of Black Muslims, but that doesn't necessarily speak to some of that secret prejudice, right? Secret prejudice, which might emerge in sort of comments about, oh, we have, our cousin Muhammad now who's coming for Thanksgiving and we can't put pork in the greens, right? So what do we do with some of the more subtle ways that Christian privilege, Christian hegemony, subtle anti-Muslim sentiment also coexists alongside of the reverence and respect for what Black Muslims have done in community, right, in terms of activism and organizing. So I think that while it's true that again, there's a recognition of contributions in some particular ways, that doesn't necessarily connote an acceptance of Islam as a legitimate form of sort of spirituality, right, and of devotion, of worship. So, I mean, there's so much more that we can say, but certainly there are other sort of political factors, right? 9/11, shifting some of the conversation. We can start with 1965 in the Immigration Act, whereas more people are starting to think about, right, who is an American Muslim? What immediately comes to mind, right? Who is that person? So there's synergy, but there's also, again, some of this underlying suspicion, guardedness, confusion, skepticism about adopting a spiritual or way of life that is a departure from Christianity.
I'm going to come back to the Q&A questions in a minute, but Kira, I see you've got your hand up, so I wanted to come to you if you want to take yourself off mute.
Hello, and thank you guys for this discussion. And like you said, and I'm not going to add content, but insight. I really appreciate having the data to be able to, like you said, validate how one's feeling. And it's such an interesting conversation. I became Muslim when I was 16, raised in the church, and my grandfather was a pastor. And I remember we were on a family call. We were just discussing things like in a family reunion, and I think it was during COVID. Mind you, I've probably been Muslim over 20 years at this point. And someone had mentioned about them being Republican. And then out of the blue, someone else said, well, that's just as bad as Kira being Muslim.
I am not
insight
surprised.
is that we definitely have these experiences.
But and those comments, I think sometimes where the comparison is drawn is that how much sort of grace and tolerance do we have for those kind of comments because they're coming from family members, right? It's
Right.
like, how do I try to understand what is essentially a microaggression, right? When these are also folks who experience their own kinds of microaggressions publicly, right?
Absolutely.
So it's like, how do we hold both that you can be someone who is a victim of microaggressions and also perpetrate, right?
And I only mention it for the people who are on the call who aren't Black, and so they realize our personal struggle, and just to give a light of what that looks like in real time. And we have a saying in our family, because we also receive microaggressions from our Muslim community as well.
Mhm.
And so we say, hey, we don't plan to do slavery twice. We actually gave up our whole kunya, our whole tribe, to be embraced in the tribe of Islam. And so to receive it on both ends. And I think the microaggressions that we receive, people who aren't, who are traditionally Muslim, they don't realize what we're experiencing. Unfortunately, I buried my mother 2 years ago, and I'm the only child. And the whole sermon actually ended up, while the family sits on the front row, it ended up being an attack session on Islam and her family that was her only survivor. And these are the things that we take. And it was her grandchildren who are all Muslim, and her daughter. But the whole church, the whole sermon was basically a yelling match and attacking, hell and damnation. And so these studies that you're doing and these conversations that are beginning, they're important because they haven't been had. So I just wanted to add what it looks like in real time.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah. And I think those moments can also be like deeply painful. And it's hard to describe at times, like the feelings of betrayal, right? It happens. And when you're also sort of balancing some of that invisibility and anti-Blackness within the Muslim community, where you're not seen as sort of authentically Muslim because you're Black, and you're not Christian, so are you really Black, right? I mean, I think kind of the balance of those questions around belonging and identity, which is, one of the reasons that this is research that also is supported by Muslim Wellness Foundation, right? How do we understand who we are and the places that we can really ground our sense of community and well-being when there are all of these questions that lead to exclusionary practices, right? Like, you don't belong with us because. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's really important.
I'm going to sort of combine two questions in the chat because both sort of ask about different subpopulations. One is someone asks and is curious about Black Muslims who are recent immigrants and whether the quote recent immigrant identity shifts how Black Christians might be perceiving Black Muslims. And there's another question about sort of the lack of media attention and attention focused on Muslims who have been incarcerated, and whether that came up at all in the research. So I'll leave both of those with you.
So to the question around sort of recent immigrant identity or Black African immigrants who are also Muslim, this was the participants of this research were self-identified Black Christians, right? Or Christian adjacent, meaning perhaps they do not identify as, church-going members, but Christianity has been very much a part of their community and identity and context. So we're asking those folks about their experiences with Black Muslims. They didn't specify, at least not that I can recall. It's often a matter of proximity, right? Who are the Black Muslim people in their lives? And it happens to be that those folks are extended family members, their friends, their colleagues. So I think it would be interesting to, I think it's a separate question about how those who are immigrants understand sort of the Black American identity and their relationship to the ways that Blackness is defined in the United States. So that can be right, a study in and of itself. To the question about Black Muslims who are incarcerated, again, the focus groups and individual interviews were with Black Christians, many of whom also discussed having family members who may have embraced Islam while they were incarcerated. And the reality is that is one of sort of the leading, I guess, I don't want to say stereotypes, but that there is this immediate association of Blackness and Muslimness with incarceration, right? With being in prison. And so that also ignores the fact that, we're as a community have grown to a point where Black American Muslims, some families can trace their, generationally 5 generations of Black Muslims. So this idea of conversion being something that happens within prison, again, I think sort of limits the expansiveness and the nuance within Black Muslim communities. Of course, there is a significant number of Muslims who are Black who are incarcerated, but that is not the only way that Black people interact and come to know Islam.
And maybe just one more question, because I know we're coming up on time. If anyone else has a burning question, please do put it in the chat. But maybe one question was about whether there were any, and I think I know the answer to this, but whether there were any regional differences at all. And is that even possible to sort of tease out? And really wondering whether there were sort of local factors in different locations that might, explain some of what you found.
Yes. So what we did note was that in perhaps a future iteration of this work, to understand the experiences of Black Christians who are perhaps in the Deep South, in more rural or suburban areas. So for those Black Christians who perhaps grew up in Northeast, the Midwest, right on the East Coast, West Coast, where the major cities, you have large populations of Black Muslims, right? So New York, Chicago, Detroit, Newark, right? Again, there's still the familiarity with Muslims, but comparatively, a lack of understanding of Islam as a religion, right? So I know a lot of Muslims, but I don't know much about what Islam is. Those who did not grow up sort of knowing any Black Muslims or any Muslims at all, did begin to encounter or have relationships with Muslims, perhaps in college. So the regional differences, again, more relate to familiarity rather than sort of depth of knowledge.
Okay, great. And maybe just one last question. Zakia, you have your hand up and waiting patiently.
Yes. Dr. Rashad, first of all, I want to say thank you for, the information that you provided in the research. It's been very interesting. I am not surprised by any of the information you presented, though. I was born Muslim, raised here. However, here in America, however, I went to a Muslim school, not a Black Muslim school, but just a Sunni Muslim school. And I have had a very interesting experience because being in that environment growing up from first grade to 12th grade, I don't think I really understood the Black Muslim and the Nation of Islam. It wasn't until I got to college and I told people that I was Muslim and everyone kept saying, "You're Nation of Islam." And I'm like, no, that's not even, I don't even think that's Muslim, like, so it was a really identity thing for me at that point that I realized that there was this difference because I'd never really, I guess, associated with that. And so I think that sometimes, in finding that there haven't been any other, big representations, I feel for myself, I kind of have shied away from clarifying myself as Black Islam or Black Muslim because I did not want to be associated with the Nation of Islam. I'm just a Sunni Muslim. I'm just, a regular Muslim. So I shied away from that. And then, in growing up, my parents converted. So I have a extended family that are Christian, and I'm involved in a lot of community activities between my kids, my sorority, things like that, where I am around a lot of Black Christians. And one of the things that I have found is a lot of times we don't speak up. We kind of just sit there, and I can use this as just a very basic, Black Christians, they pray all the time. I mean, my family, before everything, they want to say a prayer. There always is a sermon. Same thing in all of the groups. Even sometimes some of the kids' team sports, before something, they'll say a little prayer. Very rarely do you see where they will give a universal prayer. They continue to, and we never say anything. I would say over the past maybe 2 years, I've actually started saying something to say, can we use a universal prayer? You could say Lord, you could say God, but I don't, if you're praying with me or for me, I don't need to be prayed in Jesus' name. I don't need you to say, "Dear Father God," and all of those kind of things. And when I brought this up to people, they're like, "What? Like, what do you mean?" And I'm like, just say Lord, just say God, because I believe in a higher power. But I also think that part of the people not realizing anything about us is that we kind of have assimilated not to make any waves. So we just kind of go along to get along. And when things are said, we don't necessarily make the corrections or to say, hey, this is, or maybe we should do it this way. We don't make sure that our viewpoints are heard, And I know, like I said, my mom, she has never mentioned to her family ever, can we do a different prayer, or can we incorporate a Muslim prayer in some of our family gatherings? I'm just using my personal family experience. And we've been going to our family reunions and family gatherings like as long as I can remember. And I said that to somebody in my family very recently, and they looked at me like I was crazy. And I said, well, I have 7 brothers and sisters. We all have kids now. So there's a large part of our family that's now Muslim. And I'm like, we're deep. So now you have to acknowledge, like, we got to start speaking up to say, like, we're here, and I think that that's part of the reason that people can, they still have the image of the American Muslim is either the, Arab American or the Nation of Islam, Farrakhan, because, we're not speaking up enough to say we're here. And so I would say, how do we get past that?
Yeah. I think what you've shared, and thank you for sharing your personal experiences, has to do a lot with the hesitance, I would say, is grappling with what does it mean to feel excluded from basically a racial affinity space, right? How do I highlight another area of difference when there's so many instances in which I feel othered, right? It's like, well, now I'm with my family and I still feel like a part of me is not being seen, right? I think that has a lot to do with like salience of racial identity and whether or not in those instances that feels like enough right? I don't want to sort of highlight another aspect that might leave me feeling like an outsider, right? And so I think there's, again, sort of this calculation, and part of it is emotional, right? Can I really bear feeling like in so many contexts, I'm the outside, I'm othered, I'm discriminated against. And so when you're confronting family, you're like, I know they love me, so I'll give them a little grace, I'll forgive some of the comments. And in order to retain some semblance of certainty around where I belong. So I think it becomes a deeper conversation about even the emotional toll that the anti-Muslim sentiment does take, right, on Black Muslim families, right, Black Muslim sort of adults, and what it means to then open up a broader conversation with others about addressing some of those really subtle, at times, microaggressions that impact, right, a feeling of even safety and of being cared for.
Thank you so much. And Zakia, again, just thanks for sharing your personal experiences. I feel like we could have another hour's worth of conversation, but we're gonna have to stop here. I know there were a couple of questions that we didn't get to. I'm sorry. We do have the chat. If you asked a question, I know Teresa was one question we didn't get to, and we didn't answer it. Could you put your email in the chat box, and we will try to get back to you. I know there were 2 or 3 questions that we didn't get to. I want to thank you all so much for coming tonight. This is just the beginning for this project. We've been working on it behind the scenes for a number of years, as you've heard tonight. But this is really just the tip of the iceberg as it gets released into the world. And we spend the next couple of years really making sure that it gets out far and wide so that communities and decision makers have these findings and recommendations, and these conversations are being started. I really deeply want to thank Dr. Kameelah Rashad for this incredible work and for really being the spark behind this idea. It was all the things she talked about before about how this project came about. She is a very, very large reason why we are doing this and why this project is happening. Erum, just your day-to-day management and keeping us all on track and making sure this project runs smoothly. The importance of that cannot be understated or overstated. Overstated. So just thank you for the work that you do every day, as well as the team who are also working on this. Not everyone here is not everyone is represented on this call. So thank you all so much. We also deeply appreciate the funding from the Pew Charitable Trust. I don't believe they're here tonight, but we're deeply grateful for that opportunity to share this with the world. And please note that we will have a more formal webinar on this once it is sort of ready to be published. So it'll be less of a informal conversation, more of a formal webinar. But please do look out in our newsletter on social media to find out, when that's going to happen. We'll be sending this recording to you all and everyone who registered. So if you want to listen in again or share with anyone, that's completely fine. And just thank you again, everyone who chose to spend an hour of their, what evening is it? Wednesday evening with us. So thank you all so very much and have a wonderful night.
Thank you, everyone. Assalamu alaikum.